My story, my dear, begins with what seemed like a perfect love, a union blessed and built on trust, but one that was eroded by betrayal and pain. When I think of how it all started, I remember a time that was simple, without many complications. I was young, full of dreams and hopes, with my heart open to the future, and he, my beloved, was the man I imagined would always be by my side. We were a passionate couple, the kind that everyone around us admired and said we would be happy forever. What more could I want in life? Before I start, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching different places. In those early years of marriage, everything seemed perfect. He was my companion, my friend, and my lover. Every day together was filled with promises, plans, and laughter. He gave me affection, took care of me, and I loved him with a purity that only youth can offer. There was no room for doubt or fear, for we believed our love was enough to face any adversity that came our way. I gave myself completely to our life. He promised we would be together forever, that there would never be any secrets between us. But, as it often happens, life has a way of teaching us that perfection is merely an illusion. The love that seemed unshakable started to face its first cracks, and the trust I had in him slowly began to dissolve. The first signs that something was wrong came in a discreet, almost imperceptible manner. Sometimes he came home later from work, or his responses during conversations became shorter, as if he were distant, but I was so naive that I tried to ignore those small details. At first, I thought it was just the fatigue of daily life or the weight of responsibilities. I didn't want to believe that something could be affecting our relationship. After all, what could possibly go wrong when everything seemed to be in perfect harmony? But my daughter, what I didn't know was that betrayal was quietly infiltrating our home in a way I could never have imagined. I, like any wife, trusted my husband completely. He was my rock, my strength. How could he betray me? How could he look at my mother and make the decision to share something so intimate, something that should have been ours alone? I never imagined someone from my own family could be the source of so much pain. The truth came in a way that shattered me inside. It was on an ordinary afternoon, a day that seemed like any other, when I was surprised by a sight I could never forget. He, my husband, was with my mother. I didn't know what to do, my dear. My world turned upside down in an instant. I remember standing there, looking at the two of them as though I were witnessing a nightmare. It couldn't be real. How could they do this to me? How could he? And how could my mother, the woman who always told me to trust my husband, betray me in this way? I tried to understand. I tried to believe that there must be some explanation, something that could make me understand how this situation had come to be. But the truth is, there was no justification. They were together, and what hurt me the most was that, for so long, I had believed in what seemed like a perfect life. Now, everything I thought I knew about love and trust was being destroyed right before my eyes. The pain was immense. I found myself lost, not knowing where to go. I didn't know what to do with the emotions that overwhelmed me. The anger, the sadness, the fear, and the shame took over, and I didn't know how to deal with it all. He, the man who had always been my support, now became a stranger. And my mother, the woman I had always defended, now seemed to be the one responsible for one of the greatest betrayals I could ever imagine. I didn't want to believe that this was happening. I didn't want to accept that the pain I was feeling was real. It was a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My marriage, which I had thought was strong, was shaken in a way that seemed irreparable. And the worst part was that, while I was trying to understand what was happening, he was pulling further away from me. There was a silence between us that was more painful than any words he could have said. He tried to apologize, but his words felt empty. The regret he showed wasn't enough to erase the pain of the betrayal. He claimed it was a mistake, that it just happened and that he didn't know how, but deep down, I knew that what he had done wasn't a mistake. It was a choice he made on his own, without thinking of the consequences, without considering the pain it would cause. And now, all that was left for me was a broken heart and a life I didn't know how to rebuild. The silence between us continued for days, for weeks. He tried to get closer, but I was shattered. How could I trust him again? How could I look at him and not see the man who had betrayed me? How could I look at my mother and not see her as the woman who destroyed my world? I felt like I was in a maze with no way out, not knowing where to go, not knowing how to continue. Then he did something that, in some way, left me even more confused. He asked for forgiveness. Not just any request, but one filled with regret, tears, and a look that, for the first time, seemed truly sincere. He confessed everything, said that he had done something horrible and that he didn't know how to fix what he had destroyed. He asked me for a chance, not to go back, but to try and rebuild the trust, if it was even possible. I didn't know what to do with that request. Part of me wanted to believe that he was truly sorry, but another part of me knew that, no matter how much I tried, I would never be able to forget what had happened. And somehow, that request for forgiveness didn't seem enough to ease the pain I felt. I knew there was more to be said, more to be resolved. And what he didn't know was that the real pain wasn't just in the betrayal, but in the lie he made me live. Now, after all these years, I can look back and understand that life is not made of certainties, but of choices. And over the years, I've learned that, as hard as it is, there is always a way to move forward. Forgiveness, although a difficult choice, brought me a peace I never imagined possible. I know nothing can erase the pain I lived, but every day I rebuild myself, and I am grateful for everything I've learned from this difficult chapter in my life. I was so young, full of hopes, dreams, and beliefs that life would be a field of flowers, where everything would bloom in harmony. I grew up in a time when marriage was seen as something sacred, a promise that should last forever. That's how I entered married life, with my heart overflowing with love and trust, never imagining that the journey I would begin by his side would be more complicated than I could foresee. When I met him, he was everything I had always dreamed of. I remember well the day our eyes first met. It was a warm spring afternoon, the sun setting behind the mountains, and I was at the market, buying some fresh vegetables for dinner. He appeared suddenly, so at ease, so confident. It's hard to explain, but there was something in him that stood out from the crowd, something that drew attention. His eyes, so dark and deep, seemed to look straight into my soul. I couldn't do anything about it. His mere gaze captured me, and right then, I felt my life would change forever. He came over with that charming smile and made a joke about the price of onions. Something simple, but for me, it felt like magic. We started talking, and suddenly, the world around us disappeared. He told me about his plans, his aspirations, and I listened to everything with the attention of a child listening to her favorite stories. I felt that he was someone special, someone with whom I could share my life, my secrets, my joys. Soon, he began seeking me out. Every day he was there, waiting for me to have time for him. Love seemed to grow quickly between us, like a plant stretching to the sky. The months passed, and with them, our friendship turned into something more. He asked me out, to walk around the city. I couldn't resist his charm, the way he made me feel unique. Each word he said made me dream more and more of a future together. Sometimes we would go to the park, talk until the sun began to set, and then he would walk me back home. The way he treated me, with so much care and respect, made me believe that he was the man of my life. Back then, love wasn't rushed like it is today. With every meeting we grew closer, exchanging stories, laughing at little things, creating a bond that felt unbreakable. I didn't need anything more, for I had found someone with whom I wanted to spend all my days. It was simple, but at the same time, I felt I had found something that many would search for a lifetime and never find. Love, to me, was him. He was the promise of a bright future, a home full of joy and laughter, a place where life's hardships would be faced together, as a team. What impressed me the most about him was the way he cared for me. He was interested in everything I said, my dreams, my desires. He listened to me with an attention that made me feel valuable, as if I were the most important person in the world. I believed we had found the perfect recipe for happiness. He, with his natural charm, and I, with my heart full of love. As time passed, he began to talk to me about the future. He said he would like to marry me, to build a life by my side, and I, without hesitation, accepted. What more could I want than to live by his side? So he proposed to me, and with a happiness that only youth can provide, I said yes, without a second thought. Our wedding seemed like a fairy tale. We planned a simple ceremony, but one full of love. I was so happy that I could hardly contain my tears when I entered the church, arm in arm with my father, looking at him, there at the altar, waiting for me. In the first years of marriage, we were inseparable. Each morning, we woke up side by side, and in the evening, he would come home with a smile, bringing news from his day, and I would tell him about the little things I had done around the house. The children came soon after, and our home filled with laughter and running feet. He dedicated himself to work, and I to our home and our children. We seemed like the ideal family, a love story that people looked at and said, "How happy they are. They have everything they ever wanted." But as I would learn later, no love story is immune to the challenges life throws our way. Love, no matter how strong, couldn't prevent the changes that would come, and the promises he made to me would soon begin to unravel in a way I never imagined. It was at that point that I started to notice the first signs of something strange, something that was happening beneath the surface. At first, they were only small things, like him arriving later from work, or his answers during our conversations becoming shorter, as if he were distant, but I was so naive that I tried to ignore these small details. At first, I thought it was just the fatigue of daily life or the weight of responsibilities. I didn't want to believe that something could be affecting our relationship. After all, what could go wrong when everything seemed to be in perfect harmony? But my daughter, what I didn't know was that betrayal was quietly infiltrating our home in a way I could never have imagined. I, like any wife, trusted my husband completely. He was my rock, my strength. How could he betray me? How could he look at my mother and make the decision to share something so intimate, something that should have been ours alone? I never imagined someone from my own family could be the source of so much pain. The truth came in a way that shattered me inside. It was on an ordinary afternoon, a day that seemed like any other, when I was surprised by a sight I could never forget. He, my husband, was with my mother. I didn't know what to do, my dear. My world turned upside down in an instant. I remember standing there looking at the two of them as though I were witnessing a nightmare. It couldn't be real. How could they do this to me? How could he? And how could my mother, the woman who always told me to trust my husband, betray me in this way? I tried to understand. I tried to believe that there must be some explanation, something that could make me understand how this situation had come to be. But the truth is, there was no justification. They were together. And what hurt me the most was that, for so long, I had believed in what seemed like a perfect life. Now, everything I thought I knew about love and trust was being destroyed right before my eyes. I found myself lost, not knowing what to do. The pain I felt wasn't just physical, but a pain of the soul, a pain that settled deep inside me and made me question everything I had believed up until that moment. The scene I witnessed was engraved in my mind, and I couldn't push it away. What was I supposed to do now? How would I deal with this? How could I move forward knowing what he had done? How could I look at my mother and still love her after learning that she had destroyed my trust in such a complete way? What bothered me most was the silence that had settled between us. I knew he knew that I knew what had happened, but he didn't say a word. He looked at me with those eyes that I once loved, but now they seemed so distant, so empty. I waited for him to speak, for him to explain himself, but there was nothing. Not a word of apology, not an attempt to justify himself, nothing. He treated me with indifference, as if what had happened was normal. That's what hurt me most. The days passed slowly, and I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to deal with the situation, and the thought of facing my mother paralyzed me with fear and pain. How could I talk to her after everything that had happened? How could I confront her without being swallowed up by the pain? And how could I maintain my marriage, my family, my life, after discovering the truth about the two of them? It was blow after blow, and I didn't know how to deal with all of it. I tried to distance myself, to take some time to process the situation. But how could I do that when everything around me reminded me of the betrayal? Every corner of our home, every object, every memory of our past together seemed to turn into a sharp knife, cutting me, reminding me of the lie he had made me live. I looked at him, and instead of finding the man I dreamed of spending my whole life with, I saw a stranger. A man who, alongside the woman I loved, destroyed my trust and made me question everything I knew about love. It was then that, after much suffering, I decided I needed to have a conversation with him. I couldn't live in this silence anymore. I needed to hear from him the truth. I needed to know what was going on in his mind. I didn't know what I wanted to hear, but I knew I needed answers. What would he do now? Could he at least try to explain what he did? Or would he pull further away, as if nothing had happened? When we finally sat down to talk, the air was heavy, dense, and the words seemed difficult to come out. He began by saying that he regretted it, that he never thought about the consequences of what he did, but his words seemed empty. The regret he showed wasn't enough to erase what had happened, to erase the pain he had caused. He claimed it was a mistake, that it just happened, and that he didn't know how. But deep down, I knew that what he had done wasn't a mistake. It was a choice he made on his own, without thinking of the consequences, without considering the pain it would cause. And now, all that was left for me was a broken heart and a life I didn't know how to rebuild. The most difficult part at that moment was trying to understand why he did it. The reason he gave me seemed too weak, almost as if he were trying to justify something that had no justification. I knew he was trying to convince me that all of it was a mistake, but inside me, I knew it wasn't just a mistake. He had made a decision, a conscious choice. He knew what he was doing and chose to go forward with it, without caring about the consequences. I stared at him, not knowing what else to say. What more could he offer me besides apologies? I had already heard those words before, but they weren't enough. What I needed wasn't empty words, but actions. I wanted to see truly that he was willing to do something to fix what he had done, but deep down I knew nothing could erase the pain he caused. The simple fact that he had betrayed me with my mother made me look at him with a different eye, an eye that no longer saw trust nor love, but instead a deep scar, one that couldn't be removed. The pain was unbearable, but I knew I needed to make a decision. I couldn't continue living this way, with the pain consuming me every day. I needed to decide if I would move forward with him, or if the best option was to separate and start over. The truth was, even with his regret, trust was irreparably broken, and I didn't know if I would be able to rebuild it. Time passed, and although his regret was there, it didn't erase the scars of my soul. I knew I needed to make a move, not just for him, but for myself. The decision to move on wasn't easy, but it was a necessary one. I knew that forgiveness was important, but it didn't mean I should continue living with someone who had broken my trust so deeply. And so, my dear, the story that began with dreams and promises ended with pain and a choice. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that, regardless of what happens, I am capable of moving forward. Even with the scars, I can learn to live again. Time, as always, passed, not in the way I wanted or expected, but in a way that forced me to grow, to change. The pain of knowing what he had done, the way my entire life was turned upside down, was always there, like a shadow that never left me. I tried to move forward, but even when I was surrounded by friends, children, and the daily routine of life, I felt that something inside me was not healing. The weight of the lie and the betrayal was in my heart, and I didn't know how to push it away. I couldn't just pretend nothing had happened. The fact that he was still there, by my side, asking for forgiveness, trying to justify himself, only made me feel more powerless. His words, though they seemed sincere, weren't enough to restore the trust that had been destroyed. How could I keep living with him, knowing what he had done? How could I look at him and not see in that face I once loved the man who betrayed me with the woman who gave me life? The silence inside me grew heavier. I distanced myself more and more from everything and everyone. My hands, which once were quick to build our life together, now trembled and hesitated. I didn't know if what I wanted was distance or if what I feared most was the end of everything we had built. Every moment with him seemed to cause me to lose a piece of myself. I had to deal with my anger, my pain, my sadness, but I didn't know how to handle it all. I wanted to believe in him. I wanted to believe that he was truly sorry, but I also knew that my pain couldn't be erased by empty words. It was in this silence that I realized something inside me needed to change, that as much as forgiveness was important, the healing had to come from within me. I had to find strengths I didn't even know existed. I couldn't keep being a prisoner of the pain. I needed to look at myself and decide if I still wanted to live a life by his side or if it would be healthier to move on alone. But the thought of separating from someone with whom I spent so many years, with whom I shared dreams, children, so many moments of my life, seemed too frightening. I was taken by a mix of emotions I didn't know how to handle. The pain of losing trust in someone who promised me everything was devastating. But the idea of starting over, of rebuilding my life without him, also seemed almost impossible. I thought about the children, what it would mean for them, and I felt even more lost. But at the same time, something inside me began to awaken. It was no longer about what he wanted or what society expected of me. It was about what I wanted for my own life, for my own heart. I spent days and nights reflecting on what to do. I looked at him, and as much as I loved him, I knew that the pain of betrayal wouldn't be erased with an apology. So, it was then that I started questioning myself. How could I heal? How could I look at him and not see the lie, not see the pain? What would it take for me to live in peace with myself, with what had happened? I didn't have all the answers, but I knew I was taking an important step, no matter how difficult it was. That's when I began to realize that healing wouldn't come from him, nor from our relationship. The healing would come from within me. I couldn't rely on someone who had hurt me so much to find peace. He could ask for my forgiveness, but the peace I was searching for wouldn't come from his words or empty promises. The peace I needed would only be achieved if I looked within myself and found the strength to forgive myself for allowing that betrayal to happen. I needed to free myself from the pain, to free myself from the resentment and the anger that consumed me. I needed to let go of everything that prevented me from living fully. And so, over time, I began to understand that true healing came from within. It wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about accepting, forgiving, and above all, moving forward. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing that's worth it is easy. But life, as cruel as it had been, taught me a valuable lesson. I couldn't live the rest of my life chained to something that hurt me. I couldn't let his betrayal take over my story. I had to take control of my life again, allow myself to live once more, and for that, I needed to forgive myself. The decision to move forward wasn't simple, but I began to see a light at the end of the tunnel. When I freed myself from the anger, when I decided that pain wouldn't be my companion anymore, something began to shift inside of me. I started to look at myself with more kindness, more compassion. I remembered who I was before all of this. And little by little, I started rebuilding my life, even though I didn't know exactly what the future would hold. The only thing I knew for sure was that I needed to move forward. The days passed slowly, and I found myself in a whirlwind of contradictory feelings. Sometimes, I believed I had found peace, that I had overcome everything that had happened. On other occasions, the pain returned like an overwhelming wave, consuming me once again. I constantly questioned whether I had made the right decision by trying to move forward with him. At the same time, I felt lost, as if I were trapped between the love I still felt and the pain he caused me. Over time, the children grew, and the house became quieter. The kids had their own lives, and, in a way, this allowed me to see everything more clearly. What was more important now? What should I do with the life that was left? I looked at him, and a part of me still felt affection, but at the same time, I no longer trusted him. I didn't know who he was anymore. The man I thought I knew had turned into a stranger. How could I continue living with someone like that? How could I live a life full of lies? There was a part of me that said I should move on alone, build my own life without the burden of a marriage marked by betrayal. But there was also a part that still clung to what remained, to what still seemed possible. I didn't want to live with this pain forever, but I also didn't know if I had the strength to start everything over from scratch. How does one do that after so many years? How do you rebuild a life when trust has been completely broken? In those moments of reflection, I began to realize that, although he had betrayed me, the real choice was in my hands. I couldn't continue living in a relationship where trust was irreparably lost. I knew that no matter what he said, the promises of change weren't enough to erase the pain he had caused. I needed to decide whether to move forward or allow the pain to consume and define me. I knew the decision wouldn't be easy, but what brought me some comfort was knowing that, by making a decision, I would finally be in control of my own life. I had to accept that the scars he left on me wouldn't disappear. They would be a part of me always. But I also knew that over time, they could become marks of strength, not weakness. If I could look back and see that I was able to move forward, then those scars would have some value. They would remind me of who I was before and who I had become after all of this. And so, my dear, it was in the silence of my soul, in the time I spent reflecting on everything, that I made the decision that would change my life forever. I didn't know what the future would hold for me, but I knew that the only way to find peace was to distance myself from everything that caused me pain, from everything that kept me tied to the past. I needed to free myself, even if it meant leaving behind the man I had spent so many years of my life with. I knew that, no matter how difficult it was, my life had to move forward. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of the pain he caused me. Forgiveness, if it came, would come with time. But healing, true healing, had to come from within me. I had to allow myself to be happy again. I had to learn to love myself again, without guilt, without shame, without the weight of the betrayal. It was then that, with a heavy heart but a clear mind, I made the decision to move forward, to start my life anew. It wouldn't be easy, and I knew the scars would be there, but I also knew that life didn't wait for anyone. Time, the one thing I had feared, would now be my ally, helping me heal my wounds, helping me rebuild my trust in myself. In the months that followed my decision to move forward, something inside me began to change. I felt that, even with the weight of pain and the scars I carried, a new strength was being born within me, a strength I didn't know existed. How could I imagine that from such great pain, something so powerful and transformative would emerge? Life, even with its cruelties, always has a way of teaching us something valuable. It was in the silence of my own being that I began to rediscover myself. Each day, I saw myself becoming stronger, more capable of facing difficulties, more willing to live again. It wasn't easy, but every step I took away from the pain brought me closer to freedom. I didn't need to live in the shadow of what had happened anymore. I needed to live for myself, and somehow, life was giving me the chance to do that. I started dedicating myself to myself in ways I had never done before. I began doing things that made me happy, things I had put aside for years. I started walking alone, appreciating the small moments of my day, simple things like having a cup of tea in the morning, watching the sunset, and above all, beginning to listen to myself again. I realized that I had lost myself in the midst of pain and the expectations of others, and now it was time to find myself again. I began to allow myself to dream again. For so many years my dreams had been shared with him, and now I had to learn to dream on my own, to have my own desires, my own goals. It was no longer about being a wife or a mother. It was about being myself, reclaiming my identity, discovering who I was beyond what he had made me. I asked myself, what else can I achieve alone? What are my desires that had been dormant? And little by little, I started finding the answers. The path wasn't linear, my dear. There were days when the pain came back with full force, but I learned not to fear it. I learned to give space to the sadness, to the anger, to the frustration, but I also learned not to let these feelings consume me. I allowed the pain to be a part of me, but I didn't let it be my whole story. I used it as fuel to move forward, to become stronger, more resilient. Slowly, I began to set myself free. With each passing day, I felt more at peace with myself. The guilt I had carried for so long slowly faded. I understood that, despite the pain and betrayal, I was not to blame. I hadn't done anything to deserve what he did to me. He made his choices, and I was forced to deal with the consequences. But now, I was making my own choices, and they were leading me to a future where I could finally be happy for myself. The children, my dear, have always been my anchor. I knew that no matter what choices I made, I had to be an example for them. I couldn't let suffering define me, and through them, I learned how to keep going. They, who were once small, began to grow, and I saw in them the strength that I had always had, but hadn't known how to use. They became my allies in rebuilding my life, and I saw myself not only as a mother, but as a woman, as a person. I believed that by healing, I was also healing our family. And so, over time, peace finally settled in. I no longer felt the weight of the pain from before. With each step I took forward, I felt as if I were freeing myself from invisible chains. I realized that, no matter how difficult it had been, I had found my strength, and that strength had always been within me. I just had to allow myself to see it. The pain he caused me wouldn't define my life. I was in control now. I was at peace. I also began to realize that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, but releasing. Forgiveness wasn't for him. but for me. I needed to release resentment, release anger, to be able to live in peace. It wasn't about justice or revenge, but about freedom. And by forgiving myself, I was finally able to release the weight of betrayal, as if a large stone had been lifted from my heart. It was in that moment, when I looked at my life and saw how much I had overcome, that I realized true freedom wasn't in moving forward with him or without him. True freedom was in following my own journey, regardless of who was by my side. I was capable of building my own happiness again. I no longer depended on anyone to feel I deserved to be happy. The days passed, and although I had found my peace, there was something inside me that I still couldn't understand. Something was pending, like a wound that wouldn't heal. I knew my healing was within me, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't complete. I needed more answers, more clarity, something that would help me understand everything that had happened and, most importantly, understand his role in this painful web that had enveloped me. I knew something still needed to be said, something he hadn't told me, something he was still trying to hide. It wasn't just about the betrayal. I felt there was more. I knew deep down that he had something to say, a truth that, for some reason, he didn't want to reveal. Perhaps it was out of shame, perhaps guilt, but the truth was there, hidden somewhere inside him, and I needed to hear it. So, I made a decision. I would need to ask the final question, the one that would finally bring everything he had kept hidden to light. I looked into his eyes with a firmness I didn't know I still possessed and said, "I need to know the full truth. No matter what you say, I need you to be honest with me, like you've never been before." The silence between us was thick, as if the air around us had grown heavier. He looked at me, trying to find the right words, but I knew he didn't want to say what needed to be said. He tried, but the shame and fear of hurting me held him back. However, he knew that he couldn't keep the truth from me any longer. Finally, he started to speak, and what I heard was even more painful than I could have imagined. He told me that it hadn't been just a one-time mistake, but a series of decisions that led him to this point. He admitted that he had distanced himself from me, that the pain and exhaustion of our life together had driven him to seek comfort in my mother. But what hurt me even more was his confession that he had fallen in love with her. He didn't know how to handle these feelings, and instead of seeking help, chose betrayal as a way to cope with his own pain. I listened in silence, trying to understand how all of this had happened. I already knew he had betrayed me, but I didn't know that he had become emotionally involved. I didn't know he had actually fallen in love. This confession hit me in a way I wasn't prepared to deal with. I felt anger, pain, and at the same time, a deep sadness. How could he do this? How could he fall in love with someone who was my mother? What was real in our relationship then? He told me he didn't know how he had come to this point, that he regretted it deeply, but at the same time, he didn't know how to fix what he had done. He cried, something I never thought I would see. He asked for my forgiveness once again, but unlike before, this time his words seemed more sincere, more human. He was finally admitting the magnitude of his mistake, not just the act, but everything behind it. He was finally surrendering to the truth, and that seemed like the hardest thing he had ever had to do. I stood there, listening, processing everything he was saying, and suddenly, a part of me felt something inside me break. It was no longer just the pain of betrayal, but the pain of realizing that the story I had built with him, the one I thought was real, wasn't. I was hearing the truth he had kept from me all this time. The trust, which was already fragile, now seemed to have disappeared completely. But at the same time, something else happened. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was taking control of the situation. I was no longer just reacting to what he had done. I was finally able to confront him with the truth. He had told me everything I needed to know, and although the pain was immense, I knew this confession would allow me to move forward. I wouldn't have doubts anymore. I wouldn't have that feeling of not knowing what was happening behind closed doors. The truth, no matter how difficult, was now a part of my life. I looked at him with a broken heart, but with a clarity I didn't know I had. I knew that forgiveness wouldn't be easy, that the scars would never disappear, but I finally had the power to choose what to do next. It was no longer about him. It was about me. After that confrontation, when he finally told me the whole truth, something inside me seemed to change. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that the healing process would take time, but now, finally, I had the answers I had been seeking. What once seemed like a constant shadow in my life, something I couldn't understand, was now clear. The pain of being betrayed, of seeing my own mother involved, was still an open wound, but at least I now knew what had happened. And with that knowledge, the pain began to lose some of its power. The truth didn't heal me immediately, but it gave me the freedom to make decisions. I realized that the pain and anger I felt didn't have to control me anymore. I knew I had to look forward, not back. Each day was a struggle against the temptation to relive what had happened. Each memory of betrayal was a battle, but I was determined not to let it consume me. The truth he told me, as painful as it was in a way the key to my own forgiveness. I began to realize that, in order to heal, I needed to free myself from the weight of resentment. I couldn't live shackled to it. I couldn't let the lies he told become my truth. The anger, however justified it was, wouldn't bring back the trust he had destroyed. I knew that forgiving didn't mean forgetting, and in some cases, it didn't even mean continuing to live with the person who hurt us. But forgiveness meant freeing the heart from pain, making space for something new to grow. I also knew that this forgiveness wouldn't be a simple process. Every time I thought I was overcoming it, the pain would return. And so, I would breathe deeply, reminding myself that each step forward, no matter how small, was taking me further from the pain and closer to a new life. Forgiveness, to me, wasn't about accepting betrayal or forgetting what he had done, but about finding peace within myself, despite everything. In the first months after that conversation, I lived moments of intense inner conflict. Sometimes it seemed like I had found peace, and at other times it felt like anger and sadness were taking over again. I didn't know exactly what the future held for me, but I knew that, however difficult it was, I was on the right path to healing, and healing began with me. The truth he told me, and what it meant to me, made me question what I wanted from my life. What did I truly want now? I knew that he could no longer be the man I trusted. He had broken something fundamental in our relationship. But the question that stayed with me was, what did I want for myself now? I could no longer live in the past, in the lies and mistakes he made. I had to choose what would be best for my soul, for my heart. It was in that time that I began to realize that life doesn't have to be defined by others, nor by the circumstances that afflict us. I was freeing myself from the burden of betrayal, and with that, I began to look at myself in a new way. I was stronger than I had imagined, and the healing process brought me a deeper understanding of who I am. I had been able to survive something that seemed impossible to overcome, and now I was beginning to live again, with the courage to be who I truly am. Little by little, I began to reconnect with the things that made me happy, the small things in life that made me feel alive. I started dedicating myself to myself in ways I had never done before. I began doing activities that made me happy, that connected me with what really matters. Gardening, which I had always loved, became a form of therapy again. Walks by the lake gave me a sense of peace. I felt more connected with nature, more connected to myself. These small practices helped fill the emptiness left by the pain, helped create a new life for myself, away from the shadow of betrayal. I also began to reconnect with my children, who had always been my greatest support. They gave me strength to keep going, and by looking at them, I realized that my greatest responsibility was to myself, so I could be the best version of myself, not just as a mother, but as a woman. I needed to be the woman my children would be proud to have as an example, the woman who could move forward and live happily, even after all the storms. And so, over time, peace finally settled in. I no longer felt the weight of the pain from before. I had learned that true healing came from within, and that by allowing myself to live again, by allowing the pain to transform into strength, I was creating a new story for myself. The pain he caused me didn't define my life. I am so much more than that. Life moves on, my dear, and over time, the wounds that once seemed irreparable begin to heal. Don't be mistaken. The scars remain, always reminding us of what we were and what we've lived through, but they don't define us. I learned this the hard way. I learned that no matter how painful the truth is, the only way to move forward is by embracing the freedom that comes with it. I finally freed myself from the pain that had held me captive for so long. I knew that forgiveness didn't mean I would forget what happened, but it meant that I would no longer allow it to control my life. I had to free myself from anger, resentment, and guilt that were preventing me from living fully. It was a tough process, with ups and downs, but with each passing day I felt lighter, more capable of allowing myself to be happy again. Over time, I realized that freedom didn't lie in living without pain, but in accepting the pain and moving forward. Freedom was the ability to choose how to live my life from that moment on, without being enslaved by the past, without carrying the weight of betrayal as an anchor that prevented me from moving forward. I learned that I could be the master of my own destiny, that I could build a future, even after the greatest adversities. The days started to have more color, more brightness. I began to smile genuinely, without the weight of a bitter secret eating away inside me. Each day was a victory. Each small gesture of happiness was a step toward the future that I now had ahead of me. I allowed myself to dream again. I allowed myself to look at life with new eyes, with renewed hope, and more importantly, I began to realize that happiness was within me, not in the people around me. I didn't need validation from anyone to be happy. I didn't need approval to feel that I deserved to live a full life. The happiness I sought was inside me, in my ability to rise again, in my strength to move forward, in my courage to continue believing in love, but now in a different way. Little by little, the memories of everything I lived began to fade. Not that I forgot, not that I erased from my memory everything that happened, but over time, the power of the pain diminished. It stopped being the protagonist of my story. I took control of my life again, and with that, the pain lost its power. I was no longer living for the past. I was living for my future. I knew life wouldn't be easy, but something inside me now knew I could face it. I had regained my trust in myself. I knew I would be able to achieve anything I desired, with or without him by my side. I was finally at peace. I was enough, and that was what mattered. And when I look to the future now, I no longer see a path full of fear or uncertainties. I see a future full of possibilities, full of new beginnings. I know I will find new loves, new friendships, new opportunities, and that everything I went through prepared me to be the woman I am today. I am stronger, wiser, and more aware of what truly matters. I know life goes on, and now, more than ever, I can move forward with a light heart and full of hope. The story I began with pain is now the story of overcoming. I am the author of my destiny, and from this moment on, I write a new chapter of my life, a chapter of freedom, self-love, and happiness that only I can define. Today, my dear, I look back and see not only the pain and scars I carry, but I also see the strength I gained over the years. Every step I took to rise after betrayal, every tear I shed, and every night I felt alone brought me to where I am now. I have become someone different, someone stronger, wiser, and more capable of facing any challenge that life throws at me. I know that pain never completely disappears. The scars we bear are reminders of our journey, but now they have a different meaning. They represent our ability to overcome, to rise again, to transform. They are no longer just marks of suffering, but of resilience and personal growth. I carry these scars with pride because I know that without them, I wouldn't be the woman I am today. I have learned to be grateful for the pain because it taught me the greatest lessons of my life. It was in the pain that I found my strength. It was in it that I discovered my capacity to start over. Today, I can look back and understand that every difficulty, every loss, was a necessary step to becoming who I am now. I know that the future still holds challenges, but now, more than ever, I feel ready to face them. The legacy I leave is not about pain or betrayal. The legacy I leave is about my ability to love myself, to forgive myself, to move forward. The legacy I leave is about my healing journey, the power of finding peace within myself, even after the storm. I hope that by sharing my story, others can also see that it is possible to rise again, that it is possible to transform pain into strength and keep moving forward, no matter how hard it may seem. The greatest lesson I've learned through this journey is that we are much stronger than we think. No matter what happens, there is always a way to start over, to find happiness again. Forgiveness, healing, and starting over are not things that happen overnight, but with patience, self-love, and courage, we can get through any storm and come out stronger. I leave for others the example of a woman who, despite the betrayals and the pains of life, never lost hope. I leave for others the example of someone who chose to move forward, who chose to rebuild herself, who chose to find peace within herself. The future is uncertain, but one thing is certain. I am capable of facing it with courage and determination. And most importantly, I know that no matter what happens, I will always have the strength to keep going. My journey is not over, my dear, but today, I can look at life with a smile on my face, knowing that even after the hardships, the true strength lies in how we rise, in how we find the light after the darkness. What I leave for others is the certainty that, no matter what happens, we can always choose our response. We can always choose our path. The legacy of overcoming is this: the ability to rise, to keep going, to start over. My dear, after everything I've been through, I've learned that life is made up of cycles, of new beginnings, and often, pain is just the start of a new journey. I look back and see how much I've been able to overcome, but I also see how much still lies ahead. The past, as painful as it was, can no longer define my future. What I leave behind is the suffering, and what I carry with me is the courage to start over, to move forward with the confidence that, despite everything, I can be happy again. I spent years questioning whether I would be able to overcome what happened, and today, when I look at the woman I've become, I see that the answer is right in front of me. Yes, I did it, but not without an internal struggle, not without nights of doubt, not without days when fear paralyzed me, but also not without moments of clarity, strength, and determination to move forward. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew that if I chose to live, I would do so with my head held high and my heart light, even though the scars were still there. The pain I felt didn't disappear overnight. Every time a memory surfaced, I allowed myself to feel, but over time, I learned not to let it dominate me. Pain is part of life, but it doesn't have to be our constant companion. What I understood was that by accepting my story, by accepting my failures and victories, I could finally understand that the future didn't have to be dark. It was waiting for me, and I was ready to embrace it with open arms. In the last few months, I began to reinvent myself. I rediscovered myself. I'm no longer the woman who only saw herself as a wife, a mother, or a victim of circumstances. I am a woman with a story, with scars, but also with dreams, with desires, with the ability to start over. I know that from now on, everything will be different. The pain of betrayal taught me the importance of putting myself first, of listening to myself, of understanding my own needs and desires. I am no longer a prisoner of the past, nor of what he did. I am the master of my own destiny. And now, more than ever, I know that happiness depends on me. The future that lies ahead of me is unknown, but I am sure it will be built on the lessons I've learned. The healing journey, which seemed impossible, was made possible because I decided that my life would take a new direction. No matter what comes, I now have the power to choose my own happiness. The decision is in my hands. I am no longer a victim of circumstances. I am the author of my story. And as the future continues to unfold, with all its uncertainties and possibilities, I know I can face it with courage. I don't have all the answers, but I'm certain that at any moment I can choose that it's time to start over. Every new day is an opportunity to write a new page, a new story. I may not have control over what destiny holds for me, but I have control over how I react, how I build my own peace and happiness. I allow myself to dream again. I allow myself to live. And above all, I allow myself to be happy. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.